In 1976, a tortoise stepped off a cargo plane on a small island in the Galápagos, and no one watching that morning could have guessed he was about to become the most important bachelor in the history of his species. 12 females were waiting for him, 50 years were ahead of him, and an entire species, one of the rarest tortoises alive, was quietly betting its future on whether he'd be interested. This is the story of Diego, and of an island called Española, where by the 1960s, researchers walking the ground could find grown tortoises, but no young ones, not one. For decades, nothing had been born there that survived. I want to start with the island itself, because Española is genuinely unlike almost anywhere else these animals live. It's the oldest island in the Galápagos chain, low and dry, roughly the size of a small American town, sitting at the far southeastern edge of the archipelago. And the tortoises that evolved there are not shaped like the domed, boulder-backed giants most people picture. Española's tortoises have saddleback shells. The front rises up in a high arch, like a saddle turned upside down. That's not decoration. On a dry island with sparse, low vegetation, a flat-shelled tortoise can only reach what's directly in front of it. A saddleback can lift its head and stretch its neck upward, browsing cactus pads and branches a foot or more above the ground that a flat-shelled tortoise could never touch. The shell shape is a direct answer to the island's own dryness. It evolved because the food was up high and the rain almost never was. For thousands of years, that adaptation worked. Then, people arrived. Starting in the 1600s, pirates and whalers used the Galápagos as a floating pantry. Tortoises can survive for the better part of a year without food or water, which made them, tragically, the ideal thing to stack alive in a ship's hold for a long ocean crossing. Ship logs from a single stretch of the 1800s record more than 13,000 tortoises taken from these islands, and historians estimate the true number across 2 centuries in the hundreds of thousands. Española paid a steep price for being small and easy to reach, and the killing wasn't even the worst of it. Sailors and later settlers brought goats to the islands, meant as an easy, self-renewing food source. Left alone with no predators, the goats did what goats do without limits. They multiplied into the thousands and ate everything green they could reach. Española's low scrub and cactus, the exact plants the tortoises needed to survive, were stripped bare. And then came the rats. Ship rats, stowed away by accident, found tortoise nests buried in warm sand, and did what rats do to eggs and to anything newly hatched and soft-shelled. A tortoise egg takes months underground before it hatches. A rat needs seconds. So even the handful of adult tortoises still alive on Española by the mid-1900s were, in effect, the last survivors of 3 separate disasters happening at once: hunted for food, starved by goats, and their every attempt at the next generation eaten before it could stand up. By 1960, when researchers finally went looking, here's exactly what they found. 14 tortoises, 12 females, 2 males. Scattered across an island that size, that's not really a population anymore. It's a scatter of individuals too far apart to ever find each other. Giant tortoises don't roam in herds. They wander alone, slowly, for miles. And a female on one side of Española had no way of knowing there was a male on the other. Even the 2 males left were not enough, not because they couldn't do the job, but because the island itself had become too empty for it to happen at all. The most important part of this story hasn't happened yet, because in 1960, nobody had found Diego. He wasn't lost on the island. He was thousands of miles away, in the San Diego Zoo, where he'd lived since sometime in the 1930s. Collected decades earlier by an expedition that never properly recorded where, exactly, he'd come from. For years, nobody connected the zoo animal in California to the dying species back on Española. Meanwhile, in the mid-1960s, the Galápagos National Park Directorate made a decision that would define the next 50 years. They would gather every Española tortoise they could find, all 14 of them, and bring them together in one place. Not to display them, to give them, for the first time in a century, a chance to actually meet. By 1974, all 14 were relocated to a breeding center on Santa Cruz Island, under the joint care of the park and a young nonprofit that would later become the Galápagos Conservancy. And that's when someone thought to check the stud books of zoos around the world for any Española tortoise living in captivity, unaccounted for. In 1976, they found one, in San Diego. He arrived on Española's breeding center that same year, the 15th tortoise, the third male, the one who'd spend the rest of the century making up for lost time. They called him Diego. Here's what I think is easy to miss about what happened next. This wasn't dramatic. There was no single triumphant moment. What happened at that breeding center for the next 4 decades was patient, unglamorous, and, I'll admit, a little bit funny, in the way real conservation stories sometimes are. Diego turned out to have, in the words of one researcher who worked with him for years, an unusually big personality. He was active, vocal, persistent, and put simply, he was interested, very interested. Across those 12 females and the ones added later, breeding season after breeding season, year after year, Diego kept doing what a tortoise brought back from near total isolation was finally free to do: find a mate and try again. One lonely male, born from a species down to 14 individuals, 12 females waiting on an island that had nearly gone silent forever. And across 50 years, every single successful pairing was another card played against extinction. James Gibbs, a conservation biologist at the State University of New York, who has studied Española's tortoises for decades, has said Diego was quite aggressive, active, and vocal in his mating habits, which, delivered in the dry language of a scientist, is about as close as research gets to describing an animal with genuine swagger. He wasn't the only male contributing. A second tortoise, known simply by his tag number, E5, is responsible for roughly as many offspring as Diego across the same decades. But Diego became the face of the whole effort, the one name people remembered, and by the time the numbers were finally counted, he alone was credited with fathering close to 40% of every tortoise the program produced. Every hatchling from that breeding center meant one more genetic line that hadn't gone extinct. Every clutch of eggs successfully laid meant a species edging back from 14 individuals toward something that might, one day, sustain itself. Between 1975 and 2020, nearly 2,000 young tortoises, born in captivity, were carried back to Española and released onto the island their ancestors had nearly vanished from. But population alone wasn't the whole fight. While the breeding center filled with hatchlings, teams on Española spent years hunting down and removing every goat on the island, a project finished by 1978, so that when those young tortoises finally arrived home, there would be something left for them to eat. Worth being clear about something here. This wasn't one program, and it wasn't one man's success story, however good a story Diego makes. It was the Galápagos National Park Directorate and the Galápagos Conservancy running a joint, decades-long operation. Release cohorts sent out once or twice a year, tracked, monitored, and followed for survival, long after the cameras and the headlines had moved on to something else. By the 1990s, something had started happening on Española that nobody had seen there in over a century. Wild-born tortoises. Not repatriated, not released from a truck. Hatched, on the island, from parents who'd also hatched on the island. The species had started reproducing entirely on its own again. Step back for a second from the numbers and just look at the shape of the whole thing. 14 tortoises, found scattered and unable to find each other. 15, once Diego arrived. A breeding center that ran for 45 years. Nearly 2,000 young tortoises carried home, one release at a time. Goats removed. Decades passing. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, wild eggs, laid by wild parents, hatching entirely on their own for the first time since before anyone alive had been born. By 2020, biologists estimated the population on Española had reached somewhere around 2,000 tortoises, genuinely wild now, breeding on their own, spread back out across the island in a way that hadn't been true for well over 100 years. That year, the breeding program did something that might be the most quietly emotional part of this entire story. It closed. Not because it failed, because it had finished the job. The original 15 adults, Diego among them, were loaded onto a boat and released back onto Española itself. The island, most of them hadn't walked since before Diego was even born. Washington Tapia, who has directed the tortoise restoration program for the Galápagos Conservancy for over 3 decades, said he considered each of those 15 animals a conservation hero in its own right. He's described the moment of their release as one that brought him, in his own words, close to tears. After nearly 80 years away, Diego walked back onto the same ground his species had almost disappeared from. One part of this story is still unresolved, and it's worth saying plainly. Historical records suggest Española once held as many as 5,000 tortoises, not 2,000. Tapia himself has said he wouldn't call the population fully healthy yet. It's recovering and growing, but there's real distance left to cover. And there's a second complication nobody planned for. After decades without tortoises grazing the island, the vegetation grew in dense and woody, harder for the tortoises to move through than the open, grazed landscape their ancestors once knew. Bringing the tortoises back was only step one. Letting the island itself remember what it used to look like is still, in places, ongoing work. Diego is somewhere on Española right now, likely well past his 100th birthday, giant tortoises being one of the longest-lived animals on Earth. He's not the reason his species survived, not by himself. That credit belongs to a 50-year institutional effort, a second breeding male doing equally quiet work, and a park directorate that never gave up on 14 scattered animals nobody outside Ecuador had ever heard of. But he is, without question, the reason it happened faster, and the reason there's a face and a name attached to a story that could have just as easily stayed a spreadsheet of numbers. Recoveries like this one are happening on quiet islands and in overlooked corners of the world right now. Most of them never get a name people remember. I think about that 14 tortoise head count more than I probably should. How close, almost nothing left, can sit right next to, somehow, still here. Did you ever watch something everyone had written off? A species, a stretch of land, even just an old garden gone wild, quietly come back when nobody was really expecting it? I'd genuinely like to hear about it.